He slapped her on the butt right there in the school hallway in front of everyone. The teachers said nothing. The students laughed. He was sure she wouldn't do anything. He didn't know who she really was. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The morning air was still unusually crisp for a southern town in early September. Dew glistened on the manicured lawns surrounding Garden Hills High School, a sprawling red brick institution nestled among winding streets and rows of expensive homes. As the sun climbed above the horizon, it cast a soft amber hue across the school's expansive parking lot, where a lone car pulled into the farthest space near the auxiliary entrance. Behind the wheel sat Daniela Rivers, hands resting on the steering wheel longer than necessary, eyes scanning the building ahead with cautious resolve. It had been 8 months since her world had crumbled. 8 months since the tragic highway crash that had taken her husband and her younger sister in a single night, leaving Daniela with only a funeral program, a storage unit full of memories, and a hollow echo in her chest where hope had once lived. She had spent those months drifting from city to city, job to job, trying and failing to find ground solid enough to stand on. Then, after a late-night scroll through job listings she hadn't expected to act on, this posting had appeared, a contract position at a prestigious high school in the Deep South, translating for migrant students. Not a glamorous role, but one that required compassion, skill, and anonymity. She applied before dawn. They called her that afternoon. Now, parked before the school, she adjusted the mirror and caught her own reflection. Tired eyes, high cheekbones, dark skin the color of polished bronze, and curls pulled neatly into a bun that hadn't fully tamed the strands along her temples. She wore a dark green blouse, long sleeves despite the warmth, and high-waisted slacks in muted navy. Professional, modest, unassuming. She stepped out of the car with practiced poise, clutching a leather satchel against her side as if it held more than just printed schedules and a modest lunch. Every inch of her posture said she belonged here, that she was ready, but beneath it, a quiet tremor hummed in her bones. Not fear, something more complex. Expectation, vigilance, a feeling she knew all too well. Inside, the school buzzed with the restless energy of the first week. Students crisscrossed through polished corridors with backpacks half-zipped, earbuds tangled in collars, the scent of body spray clashing with fresh floor wax. A few glanced at her, registering a new adult presence before dismissing her in favor of hallway chatter. Teachers passed with tight smiles or distracted nods, too preoccupied with early semester chaos to inquire who she was or what she did. She stopped briefly at the main office, where a woman behind the counter, her hair sprayed into a lacquered helmet, barely looked up as she slid a visitor's badge across the glass. "Sign in here, hun. ID on the lanyard. Mr. Kemper will get to you when he can." Daniela signed with steady script. The badge identified her as support staff, not teacher, not faculty. That suited her just fine. Mr. Kemper, the assistant principal, arrived after 10 minutes with a clipboard and a half-hearted handshake. Middle-aged, harried, and wearing a smile that never reached his eyes, he led her briskly down a side hallway while running through a list of duties. "You'll be assigned to students flagged for EL support, some Spanish speakers, some Arabic, a few Vietnamese. We'll call you when needed. Office 2C down the hall. Supply cabinets in the back." He didn't ask about her background, her experience, or why someone with her credentials would take a position this low on the academic hierarchy. He didn't need to. Garden Hills prided itself on excellence, AP scores, college placements, a gleaming exterior. Daniela, the quiet woman of color in a minor support role, was there to fill a quota, not a space at the table. Office 2C was barely more than a converted storage room. A desk with uneven legs, a single window shaded by security bars, and a thin carpet with years of unspoken history embedded in its fibers. Still, she took her time setting up, aligned the folders, placed her nameplate, set the framed photo of her husband and sister on the corner. They smiled eternally in frozen laughter, a moment captured before the world cracked open. By third period, her services were requested. A girl from Honduras needed help understanding her math syllabus. Then, a boy from Yemen struggled with enrollment paperwork. Daniela moved between rooms quietly, gently, a presence so unobtrusive that some teachers barely noticed when she arrived or left. She did not impose. She translated, encouraged, smoothed rough edges. And for the first 2 days, she was mostly invisible. Until Friday. It began with a laugh, sharp and exaggerated, in the cafeteria. Daniela stood near the far wall helping a Thai student select lunch. At the corner table sat a cluster of seniors, boys in football jackets, expensive sneakers, haircut to perfection. At the center was Trey Johnson, tall, lean, and radiating entitlement like heat from pavement. His smile was too wide, his posture too casual, his attention too sharply focused on her. He said something she didn't quite catch, but his friends burst out laughing. A plastic fork clattered to the floor nearby. One boy mimicked a woman's exaggerated walk. Another cupped his hands and whispered, "She even talks funny." Daniela glanced their way, her expression neutral. She said nothing. Not yet. The next encounter came in the hallway. She exited the ELL room to find a sticky note pressed to her door. Google Translate in Heels. She peeled it off slowly. No one was around, though the sound of laughter echoed just beyond the corner. By the following week, the subtle jabs grew bolder. A spilled drink near her desk, whispered jokes during a fire drill. One morning, she arrived to find her name scratched out on the mailbox and replaced with "The Help." She reported nothing. Not yet. Years of navigating systems had taught her how schools handled such things: denial, avoidance, quiet reassignments. She could not afford to be removed. This was the only job where silence paid her more than protest. But she was not naive. Each incident went into a file. Notes, dates, times, photos. If the moment came, she would be ready. Among the noise, she found peace in the students who needed her. Like Aisha, a soft-spoken girl from Yemen who never met Daniela's eyes but gripped her arm tightly during translation. Or Marcus, a boy from Guatemala who refused to speak English but began writing poems in Spanish after she praised his first verse. These children did not laugh at her. They saw her. Still, the storm grew closer. During a Monday lunch, Trey passed by her table with his entourage. As he walked behind her, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough, "That's some ass for a translator." She froze. Her shoulders stiffened, but her hands remained still. He didn't pause, kept walking. His friends howled. She didn't eat that day. The laughter replayed in her ears long after the bell rang. That evening, in her apartment above the corner bakery, she sat in the dark with a cold cup of tea. She replayed the sound of her sister's voice in an old voicemail. "You always were the strong one, Danny, even when they tried to break you." Daniela hadn't felt strong in months, but the quiet voice inside her, the one she'd silenced through grief, was stirring, watching, measuring the distance between patience and dignity. She closed her laptop and opened a drawer. Inside, folded in tissue paper, was her black belt from Krav Maga certification, not for display, just a reminder. Garden Hills hadn't met anyone like Daniela Rivers. Not yet, but they would. Tuesday morning arrived with a layer of fog settling over Garden Hills High, muting the colors of the buildings and casting a pall over the green-lined sidewalks. Inside, however, the school hummed with its usual dissonance, rushed footsteps, slamming lockers, snippets of gossip echoing through sterile corridors. Daniela Rivers entered the building just as the warning bell rang, her steps even and steady, her expression unreadable. She moved past a pair of freshman boys who fell silent when they noticed her, then burst into laughter once she'd passed. She didn't turn around. She had learned not to. The hallway near her office smelled of bleach and old wood. Her desk, still the same chipped surface from last week, had acquired a new addition, a sticky note in bright pink slapped onto the front drawer. In uneven block letters it read, "Welcome to GH Garbage Hire." She peeled it off slowly, folded it twice, and placed it into the manila envelope already filled with similar relics. Her documentation was meticulous. Dates, times, approximate locations. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. She was adjusting her schedule printout when the phone buzzed. A teacher needed her in room 142, biology class. A student from Vietnam was struggling with instructions. She grabbed her notepad, locked her office, and walked briskly toward the science wing. Outside the classroom, she waited for the appropriate moment to enter. A male voice droned inside, explaining the stages of cell division. When there was a pause, she knocked gently and opened the door. The teacher, Mr. Lantham, barely looked up as he gestured vaguely toward the back. "He's back there. You can handle it," he said, returning to his notes. She stepped inside and made her way down the aisle, quietly kneeling beside the boy with the confused gaze. While she translated the assignment, she could feel eyes on her, not curiosity, calculated attention. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The same table in the corner, the same group of athletes with their perfectly styled hair and branded hoodies. Trey Johnson sat like he owned the place, back slouched, arm draped over the seat behind his friend, his grin sharp as ever. He whispered something, and the group chuckled. One of them made a kissing sound. She finished with the student and stood, offering him an encouraging nod before turning to leave. As she reached the door, a pen shot across the room and hit her ankle. Laughter broke out in full this time. Mr. Lantham looked up with lazy annoyance. "Boys, cut it out." That was the extent of his intervention. She left the room without a word. In the corridor, Daniela paused, her breath shallow. Her stomach twisted not with fear, but with something colder, familiar disgust. She had hoped this job would be different. She had underestimated the armor that would be required. Over the following days, the cruelty escalated in ways both childish and insidious. On Wednesday, her translation handouts were stolen from the copier tray. On Thursday, she found a magazine ad of a swimsuit model taped to her desk with her name scribbled underneath in red pen. On Friday, the water bottle she kept in her drawer had been replaced with a nearly identical one filled with vinegar. She didn't drink it, but she smelled it when she unscrewed the cap. A chorus of snickers filtered through the nearby hallway. She tossed the bottle, wiped her hands, and wrote down the time. The days blurred into each other, a string of small humiliations designed to test the limits of her silence. And through it all, she continued working with her students, quietly, steadily, planting seeds in soil she hoped was still fertile. Then came Aisha. The girl was barely 15, with wide, dark eyes that never quite met anyone's directly. Her English was halting but sincere, her accent delicate. Daniela had helped her draft a personal essay the previous week, and they'd begun working together more regularly. That afternoon, Aisha lingered after a group study session, clutching her backpack with both hands. "Miss Daniela?" she asked softly. "Yes, sweetheart." The girl hesitated. Her voice dropped even further. "Can I tell you something? You won't tell anyone, right?" "I won't. You can talk to me." Aisha's fingers tightened on the strap. "He touched me. That boy. The one with the shoes. The white one." Daniela's heart sank. She knew who Aisha meant. "Where?" she asked gently. "Near the lockers. He pretended to bump into me. He said something I didn't understand. Then he put his hand on my back. Lower back." "Did you tell anyone else?" Aisha shook her head rapidly. "He's popular. Everyone likes him." Daniela closed her notebook slowly, the gesture deliberate, controlled. "Thank you for telling me," she said, and she meant it. That night, she composed an email to the school counselor detailing Aisha's account. She CC'd the vice principal and saved a draft of the message in her private folder. When she returned to the school the next day, no one had replied. The counselor walked past her in the hallway with a polite smile, never mentioning the email. She checked. Yes, it had been opened. Silence. Complicity. At lunch, she sat at her usual table near the back of the faculty lounge. The other teachers clustered in groups, laughing, scrolling through their phones, exchanging lesson plans. None invited her into conversation. None had asked about her role, her history, her life. She was present, but she was not seen. That evening, she stared at her phone in the dim kitchen light, her thumb hovering over her husband's old number, now disconnected. She thought about the conversations they used to have, the long debates over justice and peace, and the difference between surviving and submitting. "You don't always have to fight," he'd told her once, "but you do always have to know who you are." She looked over at the envelope filled with evidence. Her fingers traced its edge. That envelope was who she was now. Monday came too quickly. The day started uneventfully. Her sessions with the students progressed as usual. She helped a girl from El Salvador with vocabulary cards, offered corrections on a reading exercise, and kept her expression calm as she walked past clusters of seniors whispering and pointing. She was halfway through the hallway near the west stairwell when it happened. Trey was standing against the lockers with two of his friends. The corridor was full, a swarm of teenagers moving between classes. She walked by, offering no acknowledgement. As she passed, his arm extended. There was a loud smack. His hand made direct contact with her backside. A second of stunned silence followed. Then laughter erupted. She stopped mid-step. Her eyes didn't widen. Her shoulders didn't flinch. She turned slowly, methodically, her face a mask of quiet fire. Trey leaned against the locker, grinning broadly. "Relax, Miss Translator. Just a compliment." Someone behind her whistled. Another student pulled out their phone. For a moment, the hallway was no longer just Garden Hills. It was every hallway she'd ever walked through, every job where she had been tolerated, never respected, every room where her presence had been questioned before her competence was even considered. She turned back and walked away. Not in fear, not in shame, in focus. Back in her office, she closed the door, took a breath, and pulled open her drawer. The black belt was still there, folded tightly. She didn't need to use it, not yet. She needed something else. Power, she had learned, didn't always come from strength. Sometimes it came from clarity. That night, she wrote a statement, clear, detailed, factual. She included the incident, the date, time, location, witnesses. She included Aisha's story. She listed the prior events. She cited state laws. She included a copy of the video that had already gone viral in student circles. Then she hit save. She printed 3 copies. One would go to the administration. One would go to the district office. And one, just one, she would read aloud if necessary. Because now the line had been crossed, and Daniela Rivers was done walking away. She was not a victim. Not anymore. And Garden Hills High was about to find out what happened when you push someone like her too far. The morning after the incident settled over Garden Hills High with an eerie sense of stillness, as though the building itself anticipated something. The sun rose slowly behind clouds, casting gray shadows across the campus as students filed in with their usual half-hearted greetings and too loud conversations. But those in the senior class moved with a different kind of energy, excitement tinged with uncertainty. The hallway outside the main staircase had become sacred ground overnight, the scene of an act bold enough to turn rumor into legend. Already, the video had made the rounds. The footage was grainy, shaky, but unmistakable. Trey Johnson, star athlete and future college recruit, laughing as his hand connected audibly with the backside of a staff member, and her calm, deliberate walk away as if nothing had happened. What the students didn't know, what the school wasn't yet prepared for, was that Daniela Rivers hadn't spent the night trembling in shame or drowning in silence. Instead, she had slept for 6 hours in a row for the first time in weeks. Her body had let go of a weight it didn't know it had been carrying. She had faced the fire, and now she knew who she was again. Her footsteps echoed calmly as she entered the building that morning, the satchel against her side lighter than usual. She wore a crisp blazer over a cream blouse, her heels clicking with confidence down the polished corridor. She passed clusters of whispering students and teachers who glanced up and then quickly looked away, unsure of how to engage. Some of the students looked at her with newfound wariness, others with curiosity, but no one laughed. Daniela went straight to the main office and asked to speak with Principal Wexler. He wasn't available, the secretary said. "I'll wait," Daniela replied. She took a seat in the reception area, placed a folder in her lap, and crossed her legs. The secretary fidgeted for a while, then made a call. 20 minutes passed before the principal finally emerged, tie crooked, face tight with irritation, carefully masked by administrative neutrality. "Miss Rivers," he said, offering a rehearsed smile, "is there something urgent?" "Yes," she replied, standing. "I believe the school needs to address a matter of student-on-staff harassment. I've brought documentation. May we speak in private?" He hesitated. She held his gaze, then he gestured toward his office. The room was large, sterile, with diplomas on the wall and a single photograph of Wexler with the school board at a gala. As she sat down, Daniela laid out 3 copies of her statement. Her voice was calm, unwavering. "I am filing this report formally," she began. "The incident yesterday was not isolated. This has been an ongoing pattern of targeted harassment, involving not only verbal abuse and intimidation, but also inappropriate physical contact and the circulation of derogatory content." Wexler flipped through the document with growing unease. "These are serious accusations, Miss Rivers. They're documented facts, some corroborated by student testimonies, others recorded in digital media already circulating. The behavior has been enabled by the administration's refusal to act. I have reached a point where silence is no longer an option." Wexler shifted in his seat. "I'll need to consult the district. This isn't something I can handle alone." "That's your prerogative," she replied, "but I'm prepared to make this public if necessary." He looked up sharply. "I've worked in institutions far more complex than this one, Mr. Wexler," she continued, "where children's safety was not a talking point but a principle. What happened here was not a misstep. It was the product of a culture your leadership has allowed to grow." He didn't respond. She didn't wait for one. By the afternoon, word had spread through the faculty. Teachers whispered in break rooms. Some glanced at Daniela in the halls with veiled gratitude, others with barely masked disdain. But no one confronted her. No one dared. Trey didn't show up to class, neither did his usual entourage. That evening, Daniela received a call from the school district's compliance officer requesting a meeting. She agreed and sent over digital copies of the statement, the photos of vandalism, and the video footage students had shared with her anonymously. She included Aisha's account, names redacted, outlining her report to the school counselor who had failed to act. Within the hour, the compliance officer called back. "We're opening an investigation," she said, effective immediately. Daniela's hands trembled slightly when she hung up. Not from fear, but from the slow realization that, for the first time in months, someone had listened. The next morning, Trey's father arrived at the school. Richard Johnson was everything his son aspired to be: confident, commanding, used to having rooms quiet down when he entered. He marched into the main office demanding a meeting with the principal and threatened legal action for the alleged defamation of his son's character. Wexler placated him with vague reassurances, but when Daniela entered the room with a manila folder in her hands and a silent expression on her face, the temperature shifted. "This is the staff member?" Richard said, disbelief thick in his tone. "She's the one making all this noise?" Daniela looked at him not unkindly, but with steel behind her gaze. "I'm here to protect the students," she said simply, "even the ones who haven't realized they need it." The meeting was brief. He barked threats. She responded with facts. He cited donations. She cited statutes. When he tried to intimidate, she handed him a copy of her report and informed him she had retained legal counsel. That afternoon, a letter went out to the school community announcing an independent review of student conduct and administrative procedures. By Friday, students were talking more openly in the halls. Jessica Park, a junior who had spent most of her high school career hunched under oversized hoodies and shuffling between classes like a ghost, approached Daniela after school. Her voice trembled, but she spoke clearly. "I have proof," she said, "about what they did to Mr. Campbell last year." Daniela sat her down and listened. Jessica pulled out her phone and showed her the texts, screenshots of conversations where Trey and his friends bragged about planting something in a teacher's car. The language was crude, juvenile, but damning. Jessica's hand shook as she scrolled. "I didn't say anything before because I thought no one would believe me. But what you did, it made me think maybe I should." Daniela squeezed her hand gently. "You were brave, Jessica, and this matters." Other students began trickling in with stories of their own. Photos, messages, videos of Trey and his friends ridiculing teachers, targeting vulnerable classmates, manipulating girls into silence. A picture began forming, one of a reign sustained not by brilliance or popularity, but by fear. By Monday, Daniela had compiled a file so comprehensive that even the district's legal team was paying attention. Wexler, once dismissive, now avoided her entirely. The counselor who ignored Asha's report requested a sudden leave of absence. The other staff, sensing the shift in tides, began offering help, some sheepishly, some with genuine shame. And yet, through it all, Daniela remained composed. She continued working with her students, translating syllabi, helping draft essays, never missing a step. But there was a fire now beneath her quiet. That Thursday, the district sent representatives to conduct interviews on campus. Aisha, after much encouragement and with permission from her parents, agreed to speak. She sat beside Daniela, clutching her hand, and told her story to the investigators. "She made me feel safe," she said. "Nobody else ever tried." Daniela didn't cry, but something inside her shifted again, a weight, perhaps, lifting from her chest. On Friday afternoon, the district issued a statement. Trey Johnson and his two closest associates were suspended pending further review. The school counselor was under investigation. Mr. Wexler was placed on administrative leave. An interim principal was appointed, and staff were advised that the district would be implementing mandatory training on harassment, ethics, and student safety. The news hit like a shockwave. Some students cheered, others were stunned into silence. Trey's social circle crumbled almost overnight. His supporters, once emboldened, distanced themselves in whispers, and in the space that remained, something new began to take root. Students who had never spoken to Daniela began greeting her in the halls. Teachers who had once ignored her presence now asked for her input. Even the office secretary began using her name. It was not victory. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Daniela returned to her office at the end of the day and looked at the stack of folders on her desk, applications, reports, letters from students. She opened the drawer where her black belt still rested and placed the latest thank you note beside it. She didn't need to fight with her fists. Not here. Not this time. The system had expected her to flinch, to disappear, to become another line on a resignation report. Instead, she had turned and stood, not as a victim, but as the beginning of change. The following Monday, the school grounds of Garden Hills High pulsed with nervous anticipation. The air, still heavy from the weekend rain, clung to every surface as if holding its breath along with the students and staff. The usual routines felt forced, artificial, as if the very rhythm of the school had faltered. Gone were the confident strides of untouchable seniors, the hushed laughter in corners that once housed gossip and mockery. In their place lingered silence, eyes that darted nervously across hallways, and voices that spoke in murmurs when they dared to speak at all. Daniela Rivers walked through the front entrance with the same composed stride she had adopted since day one. Yet now the gazes that once dismissed her, mocked her, or ignored her entirely shifted with something new: uncertainty, wariness, perhaps even respect. Some students turned their eyes away when she passed. Others nodded quickly and lowered their heads. The effect of her refusal to be broken had cascaded far beyond the original confrontation. Now everything was different, even if nothing had yet been said aloud. In the faculty lounge, conversation sputtered in awkward fragments. A few teachers made eye contact with her, but most still avoided direct acknowledgement. Some were clearly uneasy, afraid of what had surfaced, afraid of being implicated. Others, particularly the younger staff, appeared contemplative, perhaps even grateful. But none of it mattered to Daniela anymore. She hadn't come to Garden Hills for approval. She had come to survive. And now she intended to build something better in the rubble of silence. By midday, the whispers of something bigger had begun to circulate. Jessica Park, the soft-spoken junior who had come forward with the screenshots, had been called in to speak with district investigators again. Several other students had reportedly submitted written statements, some anonymous, others bold enough to sign their names. One of them, a boy named Marcus, who had previously stayed silent in every class he attended, had sent Daniela a folder with time-stamped logs of conversations he had overheard in the locker room. It was enough to confirm what she had already suspected. Mr. Campbell, the teacher who had left the school the previous year under a cloud of quiet disgrace, had not resigned by choice. The story, shared cautiously by Jessica and backed by snippets of recovered messages, told of planted contraband in the trunk of his car, an anonymous tip to the police, and a suspension that forced his departure. Though the police had found no cause to arrest him, the damage to his reputation had been done. He'd left the state, his name removed from the school website within days. It was clear now that it had been orchestrated. And Trey had bragged about it. Daniela forwarded the materials to the compliance office along with a personal note. This should never happen to another educator. Let this be the last one. That afternoon, a closed-door staff meeting was announced. Teachers were instructed to attend immediately after final bell, and students were dismissed from extracurriculars early. The district superintendent herself, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s with a calm but commanding presence, stood at the front of the library when Daniela arrived. At her side were 2 legal advisors and a representative from the state's education department. The air was thick with discomfort. The superintendent addressed them directly. Her words were measured, but the message was clear. A pattern of negligence had been uncovered. Investigations had verified the validity of multiple harassment claims, and evidence had emerged confirming deliberate administrative inaction in response to serious allegations. Mr. Wexler, now suspended, was being reviewed for formal disciplinary action. The school counselor's license had been placed under temporary suspension pending further inquiry. A team of external auditors would be reviewing every disciplinary case from the past 5 years, and training on harassment response, mandatory reporting, and equity in school culture would be implemented immediately. Throughout the room, expressions shifted from tension to disbelief to shame. Some teachers lowered their heads, others sat frozen. 1 or 2 stormed out in indignation. But Daniela sat still, her hands folded in her lap, the only sign of emotion a slight softening of her shoulders. When the meeting ended, the superintendent approached her privately. "We owe you more than thanks," she said. "You did what too many wouldn't, and what too many paid for in silence." Daniela nodded. "I just didn't want to be the next name quietly erased." The next morning, the entire school felt altered. Where at once Trey's name had echoed through the halls in reverence or fear, now it was met with silence, even bitterness. His absence and that of his friends left a vacuum, and in it new voices began to rise. The students who had long avoided eye contact began to speak up, not just about what had happened, but about what they had endured, what they wanted to change. A small group of girls, most of them underclassmen, approached Daniela outside her office. "Can we talk?" one of them asked. "We're thinking of starting something, a space, for girls to talk, so this doesn't happen again." They wanted her help, not to lead, but to advise. She agreed on one condition, that it be inclusive of all students, regardless of gender, who had experienced fear, isolation, or abuse. The girls nodded in unison. "We just want to feel safe again," one of them whispered. "You deserve to," Daniela said, "and you will." By the end of the week, flyers began appearing around the school. Student Safety and Respect Coalition. First meeting, Friday, room 206. What had started as defense was becoming transformation. Meanwhile, Daniela received a formal request from the interim principal. Would she consider leading a new initiative focused on student well-being and anti-harassment training? It would mean restructuring her schedule, working across departments, and helping to develop a district-wide model for safer schools. She hesitated only briefly before accepting. That Friday, she stood in front of a packed classroom. Some faces were familiar: Jessica, Marcus, Aisha. Others she had never seen before. They sat in folding chairs, backpacks at their feet, silent but attentive. Many had suffered silently. Some were there in solidarity. A few were merely curious. All of them were ready for something different. She didn't speak long. She didn't need to. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about all of you. About reclaiming your voices, your dignity, your right to feel safe where you learn. You don't need to be fearless. You just need to stop accepting fear as normal." In the silence that followed, Jessica raised her hand. "What if they come back?" "They might," Daniela said, "but now they'll find us waiting." Outside the room, the sky had darkened with a passing storm, but inside, the students stayed, talking, planning, writing. Ideas were exchanged, notes scribbled, numbers shared. The beginning of a new culture, born not from policy, but from truth. That night, Daniela returned home exhausted but deeply settled. She lit a candle in memory of her sister and husband, whose pictures still sat on the kitchen shelf. For the first time in months, she looked at them not through tears, but through purpose. The following week brought a steady stream of victories. The school board issued a public apology to Mr. Campbell, who responded with a humble but scathing open letter that made headlines. Students submitted artwork, essays, and poetry inspired by themes of courage and healing. A journalism student published an exposé on the school's toxic culture, citing first-hand accounts from students previously too afraid to speak. Even the local newspaper took notice, running a piece titled, "One Woman's Silence Sparked a School's Reckoning." And through it all, Daniela never wavered. She attended every student meeting. She advised quietly but powerfully. She continued to translate for new students, helping them navigate unfamiliar systems and language barriers with the same gentle clarity she always had. When a young boy from Eritrea thanked her in broken English after finally passing his placement test, she smiled and said, "Your voice matters too." Because that was the truth she had fought for, not just her own dignity, but theirs. Every child who had been ignored, every teacher who had been sacrificed, every truth that had been buried beneath the weight of appearances and fear. She hadn't set out to be a hero. But now that the truth was exposed, she knew this fight had only just begun. And she would not stop. The following Monday, the beginning of the spring term, arrived with a warmth that signaled not just the changing season, but a subtle shift in the spirit of Garden Hills High. There was something different in the air now, something tentative but undeniable. The school, once ruled by silence and shadows, had begun to breathe differently. The halls still bore the echoes of everything that had happened, the gossip, the rage, the revelations, but now those echoes were accompanied by something else. Voices that no longer trembled, footsteps that didn't try to disappear, eyes that met one another with a sense of mutual recognition. Daniela Rivers stepped onto campus that morning, not as an outsider, not even as a survivor, but as something more enduring, a foundation. Her position was no longer confined to translation sessions and whispered consultations. She had become a quiet leader, a symbol of a new kind of authority, not the authority of fear, like Trey's had been, or of indifference, like Principal Wexler's. Hers was the authority of presence, of listening, of seeing those who had never been seen. The student-led coalition that had formed in the wake of the scandal, Student Safety and Respect, was now an officially recognized campus organization, holding regular meetings and gaining traction with each week. Posters around the school no longer advertised prom themes or football tryouts alone. Now they included announcements for peer-led discussions, self-defense workshops, anonymous reporting sessions, and creative expression forums. The change was not instant, nor complete, but it was real. Aisha, who had once barely spoken above a whisper, now helped organize translation support circles for new students. Marcus, the quiet Guatemalan boy, had started performing poetry at lunchtime in the courtyard, his pieces raw and personal, drawing crowds that included students and staff alike. Jessica Park had become the leader of the coalition's weekly sessions, her voice strong and sure as she guided conversations that would have once sent her running in the opposite direction. For her part, Daniela had taken on a new official title: Director of Student Advocacy and Equity Programs. It was a mouthful, one that she often chuckled about with her students, but what it meant in practice was clear. She had the authority to act, to propose reforms, to mentor, to train. She spent her days moving between classrooms, leading restorative dialogue sessions, teaching basic self-defense on weekends, and continuing her work with the immigrant students who had first brought her to Garden Hills. The transition wasn't without resistance. Some teachers resented the new initiatives, complaining of too much politics or distractions from academics. A handful of parents voiced objections to what they deemed radical changes. And while many students flourished under the new climate, a few, the ones who had once thrived in the previous culture, grumbled about the shift in power. But they were no longer the loudest voices in the room. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon in early April, the school hosted its first-ever Student Voices Forum. Organized by the coalition and supported by the district, the event brought together students, staff, parents, and administrators in the auditorium. The stage, normally reserved for school plays and holiday concerts, became a platform for truth. One by one, students stepped up to the microphone and shared their stories of bullying, of fear, of being silenced. Some spoke with tears in their eyes, others with rage in their voices, but each one spoke with power. When Aisha took the stage and spoke about what it meant to feel invisible and violated in a place meant to protect her, a hush fell over the room so complete that even the air seemed to pause. When Jessica followed, recounting years of being mocked for her weight, her art, her silence, the applause was thunderous. Daniela didn't speak that day. She didn't need to. She sat in the front row, watching each of them stand where they had once crouched in shame. She watched them hold the room, command it, reshape it. And she thought of her sister, of her husband, of that first day walking into Garden Hills wondering how long she could survive. She thought of the girl who had flinched at laughter and the woman who now smiled in its presence. After the forum, the principal, no longer Wexler, but a newly appointed interim leader named Dr. Susan Graves, approached her with visible emotion. "I've worked in education for over 20 years," she said, "and I've never seen anything like this." Daniela offered a small smile. That's the thing about real change. It's quiet at first, but it doesn't go away. The school board soon began discussing permanent policy changes, including revised harassment protocols, mandatory empathy training for all faculty, and a district-wide equity initiative modeled after the Garden Hills program. It was more than Daniela had imagined possible when she'd first considered quitting after the vinegar bottle incident, when every morning felt like an exercise in endurance. Now it felt like building. Students continued to surprise her. One afternoon, she found a drawing tacked to the wall outside her office, a simple image of a brown-skinned woman standing between two broken walls, sunlight streaming behind her. In the corner, a note. "Thank you for making space where there was none." She folded the paper and placed it next to her black belt in her drawer. Not all was perfect. There were still outbursts in hallways, occasional flare-ups of cruelty from those who hadn't yet learned to release power peacefully. But there was no longer impunity. The response wasn't silence or blame, it was community. Students stepped in. Teachers spoke up. And Daniela continued showing up every day, her presence a living reminder that endurance could evolve into resistance, and resistance into transformation. By late May, the school year was winding down. Seniors prepared for graduation, their robes ordered, their futures approaching. Among them were students who had once been shadows and now stood in the light. Trey never returned. His suspension became an expulsion after further violations came to light, and his family quietly withdrew any threats of legal action when confronted with the mountain of evidence and the willingness of students to testify. The silence around his departure was both a relief and a cautionary tale, one that students referenced when discussing accountability and reform. 1 week before the final bell, Daniela received a visit from Aisha's mother. A soft-spoken woman in a floral scarf and long dress, she clasped Daniela's hands with tears in her eyes. "You protected my daughter," she said. "You gave her voice. I will pray for you every day of my life." The next day, Asha slipped a handwritten letter into her bag. It read simply, "You made me brave. Now I will make others brave." Graduation came with sun-drenched skies and a breeze that carried the scent of possibility. Students lined up in robes of green and gold, tossing mortarboards into the air with laughter and tears. Daniela stood near the edge of the stage, watching them walk across, watching them claim their moment. Jessica hugged her tightly after receiving her diploma. "I'm going to art school," she whispered, "and I'm taking my story with me." Aisha found her after the ceremony. "We're starting a summer camp," she said, "for girls like me. I'm going to teach them what you taught me." Even Marcus appeared, awkward in his gown but beaming. "Thank you," he said, holding up a spiral-bound book. "I published my first poems." Daniela returned home that night to a living room filled with cards and notes from students, each one a testament to battles fought and won. She sat on the floor, the windows open to the warm night air, and read them one by one. Some were long, filled with memories. Others were just a single line. But all of them said the same thing. You mattered. You changed something. You made this place better. She looked around her modest apartment, the photos on the wall, the soft hum of evening outside, and felt, for the first time in years, at peace. She hadn't expected to stay at Garden Hills more than a semester. She hadn't expected to lead a revolution. But now, as she prepared lesson plans for summer workshops, filed policy drafts for the next board meeting, and scheduled training sessions for incoming staff, she realized she was no longer surviving. She was living, and teaching, and building. And every time she looked into the eyes of a student who had once been afraid to speak and now stood tall with conviction, she knew the battle had been worth every bruise, every insult, every sleepless night. The school had changed. But more importantly, so had its people. And in the center of it all stood Daniela Rivers, Not just a translator, not just a survivor, but a guide, a protector, a catalyst. She had not destroyed the walls of injustice. She had walked through them, step by step, until others followed. And now there was no going back. Not for the school, not for her, not for the students who had learned at last that their voices could not only be heard, but could change everything. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to check out the next video and explore others on the channel. And if this touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.